Like, I feel like the world needs all of us in our authentic selves. And I say the world because I'm thinking about climate change, I'm thinking about biodiversity loss, and all these really challenging problems we have. I'm thinking about just the political sphere. When people are their authentic selves and they're here for what they are passionate about, I believe we will have the innovative kind of answers we need. For me, that's the nature, that's the science, it's the biology.
My guest today is Dr. Kristen Jenkins Voorhies. Thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
So today is International Women's Day. And I was wondering if there has been a woman in your life that has inspired you in your work.
A woman or many women? There's so many, but I do feel like we're here on the Science Biology Primal podcast that I want to talk about Dr. Mae Jemison, who when I was a young child was the first Black woman astronaut with NASA and went in space, and I was just flabbergasted, like a woman that looks like me, a Black woman who's an astronaut, and just sort of had a passion for science from her work. And now the work that she does, and sort of at the intersections of people, dance, interpretation, but also science, the exploration of space still is a continued inspiration, because it's not that she has these boxes that she keeps her ideas and her questions in. It's sort of a lot more open. I heard her talking about how, if we do ever pursue life on another planet, we have to incorporate so many layers of knowledge to survive, including the arts, including relationships and networks among people. So it's not just about the science and just the getting there and the exploration. So I just love that approach that she has. And again, as a little kid, I was just so impressed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you said there were multiple women. Are there some others? Is there one specifically in a biologist that you?
Oh, that's a great question. It's tough because as much as I admire many of the biologists that I've learned about and met in my career, I'm more inspired by people in my life, like my mom, or even some of my colleagues, and they are biologists, I suppose, but people in my own kind of cohort of scientists. There's just sort of these different generational differences, I would say, that I look at when I'm looking at, again, my mom she was not a scientist. Nobody in my family was a scientist. And so she finished college not until I was in high school. So it was a kind of resilience and pursuit of her own education that inspired me. When I look at my peers who I went to grad school with, who are scientists in the field, they, pursued against sort of a lot of bias, a lot of challenges, a lot of sort of self-doubt even. And so when I look around, it's the people I'm in community with that inspire me. Certainly I could throw out, your Rachel Carson. I could, throw out, my mind is going blank, of course, but I say Rachel Carson because of my work at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and understanding the impact of the silent spring on our conservation world. But yeah, I have to keep thinking about now.
That's all right. There's no pressure.
Yeah, it's one of those things you're like, oh, of course.
No, yeah, I mean, your first answer was fantastic. So what do you think is the most controversial thing happening in the world of biology today?
That is the question I expected you to ask me. Well, certainly in the last couple of months, you have significant change in terms of federal funding for science in the United States. That is really challenging, how the whole system is set up. How we get funding, how we do science, who gets the funding, what institutions hold the funding, all that. I do think that's controversial because it may not entirely be bad for us in the long run when we step back and look at have we been working on this the right way? But it's really damaging and scary in terms of doing good science that we want to keep going with. But if you take aside the last couple of months, which have been sort of abrupt for a lot of us. I have always looked at the tension between maybe knowledge held outside of a scientific context, knowledge held by people in community, people, indigenous knowledge held by others who have a connection to nature and who absolutely tend to and care for the nature around them. And then the science that we do to kind of have this formal approach to knowledge. So it's that tension, I think, is controversial because you have the need to certainly validate and hold accountable people who are asking scientific questions and providing information for all of us to be looking at our natural world. But there's room for each of us to add to the conversation. And whenever I've talked about my science and research, I've tried to hold space for what other knowledge people might bring to the table. And others have kind of said, well, hold on, that may threaten or undermine my scientific voice, my professional scientific voice, by holding space for other people's knowledge and experiences. And to me, when you scale that up to climate change, when you scale that up to the need for all of us to make behavioral changes in our lives, it becomes a real important factor. Because if it's all about the scientific facts and solutions that are coming down from the ivory tower, then people are not necessarily as invested or feeling themselves included in the solution and in the outcomes, which is absolutely necessary for climate change. So I think that tension is what I would say is controversial, how to include other types of knowledge besides our traditional academic style of knowledge.
Yeah. Could we talk a little bit about your marine work that you've done?
Sure.
Why did you choose bivalves to study?
That is a fun question. My parents would sit here and look at you and laugh because apparently when I was a child, I loved seashells. We would go to Florida. We had a timeshare, in Florida, and would go to Disney World sometimes. And there was a place called Shell World, like it's gigantic mega store, and you could go in and just everything was made of seashells. And I would just spend, 15, 20, 30 minutes, if they let me, digging through the bin of just seashells, like not looking at all the items made out of seashells, but just digging through random seashells and looking at them. I've just been so fascinated by the colors, the shapes, the textures. And as I became a scientist, I started to see all the layers scientifically that they are useful. I mean, they are environmental indicators. They create their shells out of the materials in the environment around them. So they are tracking the environment. They have been around they've been extremely successful evolutionarily as a group, bivalves. They're in every type of environment. They have diversified. They have learned how to expand their ranges, narrow their ranges. You can just find bivalves everywhere. And I just find them to be really cool. There's sort of endless information you can collect from bivalves, whether you're looking at which species are there or whether you're cutting one shell open and looking at the components of their shell, the metals, the level of oxygen they've incorporated, like those things give you information. And so whether it was in I did some research in Germany, which was clams from Antarctica, and we were cutting them open and we were able to look at their growth rings like a tree. Like when you cut a tree open and they have growth rings, clams have that as well. And it's called sclerochronology. It's different from dendrochronology for the trees. And we would track the El Nino, La Nina Southern Oscillation over 40 so odd years because it was encompassed in this bivalve's growth rate. And it's just amazing. It's also one of those animals that you can easily overlook. Yeah. So there's kind of a Cinderella story there in some cases, of like what you didn't expect or what you might not have otherwise valued significantly. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Definitely. So how do you evaluate the shell then? Do you look at a cross section of it?
Yeah. So the clam is like this, right? And has a hinge right here. This hinge is called the umbo, and you can I wonder how Americans say it, because I was in Germany, so they call it the umbo in Germany. So maybe the English pronunciation is different, but that hinge is like a knot that if you were to, slice it straight down the middle, you will see these different lines of its growth over time. So like the little shell gets bigger like this to us when we're looking at it morphologically, but when you have it in that like knot, it's the rings. And you can just looking at a picture that you might scan, you can measure the size of those rings to sort of see the amount of growth each year, which is dependent on nutrients in the environment, dependent on the amount of sort of sunlight and daytime. So it's like, that causes the nutrients to bloom, causes the animal to be able to get access to them. Or you could drill little holes in each one of those rings, and that's when you can take samples and you can get things like
chemical,
you can get like sodium, potassium, you can get like the little pieces that go together to make their carbonate, calcium carbonate shell.
So it's very similar, like you said, to the growth rings on a tree then.
Very similar, same principles.
It's interesting. I don't think most people, myself included, would know that.
Yeah.
What can benthic, well, maybe we should define what benthic is. Benthic bivalves, tell us about marine communities in general.
Sure. Yeah, so benthic is a jargon word for the bottom of the ocean, the seafloor. Anything that lives down there that kind of sort of is in the seafloor, the fish are pelagic. Pelagic is the zone of the ocean, above the benthos, so it's like the birds in the air, so fish in the water. Benthic would be, the soil that the kelp grow out of California, or for my case, the bivalves burrow into, and they live deep into the sand. And benthic bivalves have the ability to, again, they're building their shell from the environment, but they're also eating from the environment. So they're eating and they're pooping. So they're changing the environment. They're dying in the environment. So their shells are being left behind in the environment. They're breaking down the shells. So when I was doing research in my dissertation, so I did my dissertation at the University of Chicago, and I looked at marine bivalves in the benthos in the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Oregon. I looked at the dead seashells alongside the living seashells, so the living bivalves. And this was called a live dead analysis. My advisor, Susan Kidwell, is a paleontologist, and I had a co-advisor, Tim Wooten, who's a marine biologist. And Sue was looking at these assemblages, these of dead organisms, we call them death assemblages, to sort of calibrate the fossil record, to look at how much information from what's living in an area gets taken into the first pre-death, pre-fossil record kind of assemblage. And when I was working with Tim as a marine biologist, we're asking questions like, well, what happened in this area before we observed it? So I saw the live dead analysis as kind of the forward-facing tool. She's looking at calibrating the fossil record. I was looking to calibrate a historical point to go forward to compare the living communities to. So I called it a baseline, right? So an unobserved historical baseline. And what I was able to look at was what species were there, who was home historically versus who was home now, the abundance, so how many of each type of species were there compared to now, when there were interlopers, when there were some species that were not present in the death assemblage that were present there now in the living, or vice versa. And we were able to find a couple of things that, there had been some dumping. They were dredging out the harbor, and this is outside of Oregon State University lab, Hatfield Marine Laboratory, and Newport, Oregon. They were dredging the harbor, and then they were dumping the dredged oil, and the living samples had not picked up any change in the environment because that dumping had happened like 20 or 30 years prior to when they started sampling the living. My death assemblages picked that up because they went back almost 100 years. So it wasn't that the dumping was bad, it's just that it shifted that community in a way that the rest of the environment hadn't been shifted. So again, you're looking at just like what's in the soil, and like it's this kind of open accumulation of what's happening in the area. And if you can go through it kind of systematically and interpret it, you get a whole different perspective on the area.
Yeah. So in that specific area that you were looking at over 100 years, what What have you noticed? What changes have you noticed have happened in that 100-year time frame?
So remarkably, it was stable. Not a lot of changes. The death assemblage compared to living assemblage were very strong, in strong agreement with one another, except for the one side that had the dredge spoil dumping.
Yeah.
What's fascinating, however, is that the strong agreement was different between shallower parts of the shelf. So the land going into the ocean is kind of going deeper and deeper. We call it the shelf, the continental shelf. The shallower part of the shelf compared to the deeper part of the shelf were two different sets of communities, both in the living and the dead. So if the shallower part is like this, the dead was like this, and you're like, there's these guys here and these guys here, consistent for 100 years. So not a change, but something was consistent. And when we found out, through kind of looking at the different factors that could be driving this very interesting split, it was the wave base. It's where the waves start to interact with that continental shelf. So when it's really deep in the ocean and the waves are circling like this, then they start to get to the point where it's shallow enough they hit the bottom. That separated these two communities. Well, we're doing a lot of work with wave energy these days. So we're doing a lot of collecting wave energy for the same way we do wind energy. And if we're extracting that energy from those waves, that's going to change how the physicality of the wave base starts to interact with the seafloor, which will change how that pattern that I've said has been there for 100 years exists. And that's, we don't really know the outcome of that. But, going back to your question, why the benthic, a lot of fish eat these clams and things. And it also, they filter a lot of the water. So they help with the cleaning the water all the way up the water column to the surface. And so what happens to the fisheries that exist off the coast of Oregon? What happens to the overall health of that ecosystem if you change the basic foundation of it?
Yeah.
We don't really know, but it's also something that we could monitor and keep track of as we collect wind energy off the coast there. So that was another really cool way to look at, look going forward, we don't have a change yet, but we have information to suggest that we have a really strong pattern that we don't want to change, or maybe we don't want to avoid, we don't want to miss the shift that could occur.
Now, were you just looking at one specific species of bivalve or multiple species?
The whole community.
The whole community.
Yeah. And I should say that there are several things that certainly affect what gets preserved when the bivalves die. So some of the individuals in the community have like really thin shells. And so their shell is going to break down a lot quicker. So there was bias, is what we'd say. So you could predictably say, these species are absent from what's dead because they are more likely to degrade before they get preserved. You have some species that live really deep in the sand, and they may not sort of be mixed up to the surface as quickly, and so they would bias that way. So that's kind of I would say the sort of filter through which I had to study certain species. It wasn't exclusive of all the species, but there were certain ones that we had to put like caveats to of why I wasn't looking at them. And then again, because my advisor, Sue Kidwell's been doing this for a long, long time, and she's done these lab studies all over the world. She, kind of knows which families have the sort of stronger presence in the assemblage, the aragonite compared to calcium carbonate, like this type of particular structure of how they make their shells that makes them preserve longer. And that goes all the way into paleontology and why we have certain things preserved better in the paleontological record, the fossil record. So I would like caveat that I didn't do the whole community, but to answer your question, yes, it was everybody that was there that I could see and I could evaluate.
Now, did you go to Antarctica? Did you have
No, I did not. There was a number of samples already in the lab when I got over to Germany. And there was also a cruise, research cruise leaving to go to Antarctica while I was there. But honestly, they were going to be on the boat for like 4 to 6 months.
Oh yeah, that's so.
And when I was in Germany, I was there for a post-bac program. So I did it after undergrad for about 10 months. So that would have been a significant part of my time that I was going to be living in Germany. And I, as much as I love the science, I will not give up everything for the science, including my own personal space. Being on a boat for that long, I just wasn't capable.
That is a long time, yeah. Can you talk about the importance of building these baselines for study?
Yeah. One of my questions when I was looking into grad school, talking to different professors I would work with was, how do we know when something is changing or just varying with time? You know, this is a question a lot of people have with the weather right now. Is it just that we normally have in Chicago days that are super hot and super cold right next to each other? Or is this a significant shift from how it used to be, you know, when I was a kid? You know, so that's where baselines really help us, because we have only a short memory of our own experience, but even so, we have a bias of the most recent memories of our experience. And so this is, you know, something that, there was a study that I quoted. It was, I think her name was Sarah McLennan, in my dissertation, where she looked at trophy fish in southern Florida over 20 years. Trophy fish from the 80s until the early 2000s. And the winners, of course, were significantly different. So in the 2010s, the winners were, you know, yay big.
Yeah.
80s, 70s, the winners were, you're standing next to them, right? And if you are a person who didn't have that picture from way back then, you might be really impressed by these, and you might not be concerned that this size fish is now the biggest fish that you can get when you're sport fishing. So without baselines, we don't have a way to sort of step back and say, what's going on here? Is this okay? Is this not okay?
Right.
And certainly baselines are important to take into account at multiple scales. I think I've talked a lot about scales of time and also size. So there's like right now scales of difference, but there's also over time scales of difference. And so we look at all the way back to sort of the Pleistocene, which is probably most recent. And if we go even further than that, you know, those are baselines, but we're not comparing to those baselines because those are not necessarily the most informative for things that we want to see right now. So it depends really, I think, on the questions you're asking. I always like to think about our own personal experiences. I'm sure you have things in your life where you're like, well, you know, when I was X age, I preferred having this kind of food in my fridge.
Right.
It's a baseline, right?
Yeah.
So we all use that information, and in science, it's really helpful to catalog that information so that we can refer back to it, and our future generations can as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a very important thing, I think, across all fields of science, creating these baselines, especially in biology.
Especially in biology. One of my favorite sort of ideas is, you know, that we are kind of all part of nature. We're not just like separate from nature. And if you kind of go back to like the human baselines of our interaction with nature and how we've evolved alongside nature, you realize that like without our relationship to nature, we wouldn't be successful as a species, wildly successful as a species.
Yeah.
So from a biological sense, like we already have so much evidence that we need to continue to collect this information around other species, around biodiversity, around the changes in our climate, changes in our solar system. Like it's clear because it's given us success as a species to being on this planet. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, absolutely,
it's
yeah.
sort of a little bit meta there.
Where did you grow up, and how did that affect who you became?
I grew up in Maryland, so I'm an East Coast girl. I grew up in Columbia, which is a suburb outside of Baltimore and DC. My dad was from Baltimore, grew up in the city. My mom from Connecticut, but they met at college, University of Maryland. And growing up, I think I mentioned earlier, you know, I didn't have anybody, no uncles, neighbors, people who were scientists. But I always had this kind of like curiosity towards nature, which I think generally people have, and it manifests in different ways. But my favorite thing about interacting with young children, they're just natural scientists. They have questions about everything. They like, it's innate. And so growing up in Maryland, we did go sailing on the Chesapeake Bay often, and so that kind of influenced my passion towards the water, towards the marine environment. We went to the Baltimore Aquarium when I was a kid, and at that time it was one of the best aquariums, in the country. It's I still think it's an amazing aquarium, but the impact on me of just like seeing the animals, seeing the environment. I don't know if you've experienced this. You've been in the field, Paul. You've been out and you've done things. Like there's something that happens physically, right?
Yeah, it is.
When you're in nature and you're like, it's hard to describe in adjectives. And so for me, that environment, I grew up in Maryland off Chesapeake Bay, is what really influenced my passion for science. Growing up in a family where there wasn't scientists, where there weren't, individuals who were in the field, I think that influenced me in terms of my desire to be so much more connected to people in terms of communicating about science. I'm not kind of typically stuck in my jargon area, and I'm not typically stuck in all the details, but I'm so much more oriented around like connection. And of course, growing up in it was a predominantly white area, predominantly white schools. My family, we're Black. That, of course, this is America, impacts my identity, and having to kind of grapple with that. I'm not trying to be like flippant about it, but one of the things that typically comes up when I'm talking about my identity as a scientist and otherwise is that you're a Black scientist or you're a Black female scientist, and like I'm a person and I happen to be Black and I happen to be a female. Right. So me as a person is one of the like focuses whenever I'm talking about my identity. But certainly through undergrad, through graduate school, I experienced a lot of bias around those other identities, and I know a lot of people can relate to that. It forces you to kind of question, if I'm passionate about this, and this is kind of what I've been created to do, why am I having such a harder time? Why are people doubting that I belong here because I don't look like everybody else here? And that brings me like so much value around interacting and outreach, or even with people who I'm just meeting, because I don't know what they were created to do. Like I feel like the world needs all of us in our authentic selves. And I say the world because I'm thinking about climate change, I'm thinking about biodiversity loss, and all these really challenging problems we have. I'm thinking about just the political sphere. When people are their authentic selves and they're here for what they are passionate about, I believe we will have the innovative kind of answers we need. For me, that's the nature, that's the science, it's the biology. And so that I think does come from growing up in a more, it's kind of urbanized, right? Like I didn't have wilderness to go. I didn't know that wilderness was a thing in the United States until I was at a training for my job at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's areas in the western part of the U.S. that are just labeled wilderness areas. Wilderness, We had parks, but nonetheless, that feeling I talked about when I'm in nature is something that I had access to as well. So how does this all influence me is such a big question, but it's kind of the values that I hold that I move through lots of different spaces. So, we've talked about me doing marine science. Well, I've also worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on endangered species listings. So entirely terrestrial, entirely vertebrates. I did eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, the monarch butterfly, invertebrates, and birds, eagles. And when I was with the U.S. Geological Survey, and we climate change, Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, it's a mouthful, but essentially I've moved through a lot of different scientific spaces, but I'm carrying similar values around connecting to nature, around holding different knowledges, around wanting to value people for who they are authentically, because I know I haven't been, and people have come into the room and looked around saying, where's the expert in the room? I'm right here. So again, that where I grew up and how it influences me, it kind of comes down to those values and of course, I should also mention as an American, I have different values. When I was doing my study abroad in Germany, it was after college, so it was like a longer period. I really realized how my Western perspectives, my American perspectives, frame so much of how I did science. I would, for example, walk into the professor's office, Tom, I need to do da 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 da, right? And my colleagues were like, oh, clutch their pearls, because you talk to the secretary, you make an appointment with the professor, you call them Herr, Doctor, Professor, you don't just casually. That was a very kind of American thing. And so all of these parts of my identity absolutely influence like how I do science, which is what I think we all kind of carry. So there's this excitement I have around let's do the science, let's talk about the content, let's talk about the biology, and also let's like connect as people, and let's be who we are. Let's bring your perspective, Paul, that is really valuable to the work, right? I think that'll stop there. I just had to kind of answer your question. It's a lot.
But just to go back to your the feeling you experience when you're in nature, I think is something that I can certainly relate to. It is almost dare I say, a spiritual thing. And I think the science backs that up too, that when humans are more disconnected from nature, it affects their health and well-being.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah.
Well, you had mentioned the eastern Massachusetts snake, rattlesnake. Could you talk a little bit about the work you were doing with that species?
Yeah. So in the process of finishing my dissertation, so I have to go back a couple of paces. I'm going to get to eastern Massachusetts. But in the process of finishing my dissertation, I started to look for what kind of work I would do. I actually was, I'll be honest, I was not in a great place. Grad school can be really hard. And I was thinking, what could I do if I even just left with my master's and didn't finish this PhD? And I saw the opportunity at the local U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office to do an internship. And when I talked to the supervisor there, the internship work was around the eastern prairie fringed orchid, which is an endangered plant here in the Midwest. And it was around like going out and working to enhance the habitat. Which was not at all my area, right? I'm a marine scientist, looking at historical baselines, but I was just like, I want to do science and I don't want to have to jump around at postdocs. And I also have experienced so much bias that, I kind of wanted to try something outside of academia, see if it was different. That supervisor was telling me that their office was doing the first ever species status assessment. So species status assessment, we call them SSAs, were a new tool that the Fish and Wildlife Service developed to separate the process of collecting science on a species that was being evaluated for listing or delisting or one of the other classifications, and the decision part. So there's the science part, and then there's does this species meet the need for intervention by the federal government? And so these species status assessments were sort of a hefty scientific document that they were just wrapping their heads around. And when I was talking to the supervisor, she brought it up because I'm talking about my PhD experience and everything. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense to me, especially because I could see how you'd have to take into account the evolutionary history of the species, the current population status of the species, its range, its threats, all these pieces. And she was like, we need you. Please come help us with this. Yeah. So I actually didn't even know that I would be, kind of useful in that way, given what I had been trained in the PhD program, in terms of how to parse out like a problem that doesn't have a clear answer, how to collect the different evidence. And she brought me in as an intern. I had to actually stay in the graduate program to do the internship. So I finished the PhD, but I was also working at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the species that we were doing was the eastern Massachusetts rattlesnake. So 10 years prior to when I started, 2015 is when I started at the Fish and Wildlife Service, they had done a huge evaluation of the populations of the eastern Massachusetts rattlesnake. It was, its range is kind of from southern Illinois through Michigan, a little bit. There's some populations in New York, some in Pennsylvania, west of Illinois. There's some in Iowa. It goes north up until Wisconsin, not quite Minnesota. But over time, those populations have been winking off. But the populations in the state of Michigan and somewhat of Indiana were really strong and really large. And so this question becomes really nuanced because you're like, well, the overall species range is contracted. So the question of listing is like, will this species survive into the future with or without the intervention of the federal government? Will it be able to withstand the threats it sees? Will it be able to, continue to be thriving? But if you have these populations in Michigan that are really huge and thriving, does it matter that the range has contracted? Mm-hmm. Or do you have to have those other populations? And so my work became reading all the literature, reading updated literature, finding what information was being gleaned from the new DNA. Like 10 years ago, the skills, the tools that we have in DNA analysis were completely different than they are now. Mm-hmm. Now we can do a lot more. So I had to kind of basically sift through all that information and interpret it in a way that was still scientific. This is what the science is saying, but this is also not what the science is saying. These are also the uncertainties we have to consider. What is that, those error bars, kind of, here's the answer, but there's like this wiggle room around it in order to give a decision maker a chance to say like, well, our values are around keeping the species present, or our values are around keeping the species diverse in terms of its population makeup, those kinds of things. And I could bring in the science that says, okay, here's what you would need for that. Here's what you would need for that. Mm-hmm. So that's the work I did with the Mastersaga. It was already listed as threatened, but they were, it was already considered a candidate for listing, which means that they had kind of decided it should be listed, but hadn't listed it yet due to other things. Mm-hmm. And so we were kind of taking it the last step to being listed as threatened. And I got the chance to, present the science that I had compiled to the decision makers. I got the chance to rebuild a population model that we had for it. So we had a sort of mathematical model that gives you like a formula. Here's this many, this number, this place, this thing, and you could kind of run it all through 100 years forward and see where the population goes. And of course you get a number of different trajectories, and then you estimate which one's most likely, and then you toggle the different threats and the different impacts. And so I actually spent time to recalibrate that model, put new kind of factors into that model, and then look at the population trends over time. So got to use some of my statistical, mathematical things I learned in grad school, basically, things that I had learned and I didn't know where I would ever use it.
Here's an example, yeah.
And because it wasn't the way I thought, but it was certainly in a way that was helpful to answering those questions, the practical policy questions. So that was the work with Mastersaga, and you can find there are Eastern Mastersaga rattlesnakes at the Lincoln Park Zoo, which is really cool. So you can go see them there. You can see them in a lot of zoos and aquariums, but if you go to Michigan, it's like not. There was a story that somebody forwarded me of somebody who was paddleboarding and Eastern Mastersaga climbed up on the front. Like, they're actually really shy species, so I have no idea why this happened, and they don't necessarily, they're not aggressive or attack. The only times there have been human-snake interactions have been a few things, certain age groups, certain influences involved. And so I don't know why that happened in Michigan, but you could Google it, Eastern Mastersaga, Michigan paddleboarder, and you will find the story. It's fascinating.
Because it is a venomous species, right?
It is a venomous species, and that was something that came up when we did the listing as well. People, why on earth would you protect a venomous snake? But again, it comes back to this nature conversation. Biodiversity is not just made up of everything that is safe and easy. It's made up of a unique interaction of a lot of different things. And so the way the Endangered Species Act is written is that we are trying to preserve the biodiversity into the future. It's not just, it is species specific, but it's the species and how they interact, which involves their habitat, involves the interspecies Connections. So yeah, there was a lot of questions actually around the listing of like, what? This makes no sense. It's a venomous species. Well, you know, some of us really like to have pets that are different. And so those pets should have, you know, sort of the same rights as other pets, you know, for lack of a better analogy.
So did you do any work with that orchid that you had mentioned as well, or no?
No, the closest I came was collaborating with the biologist of the office. Her name was Kathy Pollock, on a couple of conferences we did with her. She had a whole team of these incredible volunteers who got these plants need to be hand pollinated. So like the pollinator that used to fly around is no longer at least abundant enough to keep them pollinated. And so there's a couple of insects that they think could be it, but people will go out and literally with Q-tips and we'll like hand pollinate these flowers. It's incredible. So I never actually got that to that level, but I did help to, you know, review again the sort of literature, the science, keeping that information up to date, because every 5 years you do reevaluations for the species that are listed. And there were times I had opportunities to go out and support Kathy, like on a field day, but I didn't actually get very much involved.
I just read something recently about butterfly populations declining worldwide. I know you did a little work with monarchs. Do you mind expanding on that a bit?
Yeah. So again, it was the species status assessment, the SSA. It's this question of, should the United States federal government list the monarch butterfly as an endangered species? And there were a number of other butterflies that are already listed and being considered for listing, but I was working on the monarch, and we've talked about my marine stuff, right? So I am not an expert in like terrestrial animals or butterflies. So I was a little bit anxious about getting involved, because I'm like, this is an iconic species. People, there's so many shows that I see have a little picture of a monarch butterfly just because it's aesthetically pleasing. So it's an iconic species, and getting involved with the species status assessment really required getting down to the Endangered Species Act level of precision, which meant as an invertebrate, it can only be considered as an entire species. When it comes to vertebrates like bears, wolves, you can look at something that's called a distinct population segment. So you can look at just a range and say, in that range of northern US, how are bears or wolves doing, right? But for invertebrates, they don't have a similar sort of corollary. There's something called significant portion of the range, I believe, SPR. It's sort of like if you have a range of the species and there's a part of that range that has a characteristic for the species that is not found anywhere else, then you can protect it. And this brings me back to America, because the migration of the monarchs here in North America is not something that happens like worldwide. So you can find monarchs worldwide, but they don't migrate in that same way with the multiple generations and then like the great grandchildren going back to the same spots in Mexico to overwinter. So for people who don't know, monarchs in the United States and North America migrate north from Mexico all the way up to as far as Canada every spring, and they migrate in stages generationally. So there's a generation that comes out of Mexico and stops in southern US and Texas and breeds and then dies, and then their offspring travel further up and breed and die, and their offspring travel further up. So you can find these maps that show this. And then there's a super generation when it starts to change seasons that lives much longer than the other breeding generations and doesn't breed. It just travels all the way back down the US to the spot in Mexico where they overwinter until the next season when they migrate north and breed and die. So they live this extra long period of time. That is really remarkable for an insect to hold on to that information and to travel that far. They do have a sort of migration in South America. They do some type of migration in Australia, but these are looked at as more like range expansions. So they have generations that move out, but then they kind of stay. So these individuals here are still here while they're moving out and moving back in. So that means that when we were looking at the species, we had to answer questions like, what is different about the North American population? Is this migration something that can happen again if we were to lose those here in North America? Because it's still part of the DNA. There have been DNA analyses of all of these individuals across the world, and they are still very similar. They're close enough related that they are not a different species. So theoretically, you could take a butterfly that doesn't migrate in Hawaii and put it in Chicago, and it might evolve the ability to join in on that migration going to Mexico. So does that mean that the United States federal government needs to protect this population here in North America if they're all over the world? Like, that is a really sticky question, and it's not just based in the biology, right? Because the way that evolution happens is not predictable. It's, we are preserving kind of what we see as current traits of the species, so that as selection happens, the different traits can maybe be successful over time and that species persists. Yeah. But we don't know what are going to be the selection factors that are going to cause certain traits to come up. We don't know what caused the migration to become so prevalent here in North America. Those are also very theoretical concepts when it comes back to the question of the decision makers and the listing. Yeah. For example, the population in Mexico every year is measured in area because the number of bugs is so dense that they can't count them individually. So a decision maker was asking the question, like, why on earth am I considering listing a species that numbers in the tens of millions? Compared to when you're looking at wolves or bears, right? And you're talking about hundreds or tens, dozens, right? And so it was a really, the work I did was really in trying to translate so much of evolution and the unique kind of biodiversity value that these monarchs brought into very practical policy-related implications. And so if you Google monarchs, or if you know anything about them, they are protected, at an international level. And again, they are super valued. They're culturally super important. So you also have this social value that, like, no, protect the species because it means a lot to people. It means a lot to a lot of different cultures, for the migration, for the regeneration, for the rebirth, for all these things. But that's not quite what the Endangered Species Act is measuring, right? So I didn't necessarily do any experiments with them when I was working on it. It was simply a matter of getting really, really in touch with the scientists who are doing that current work. I spent a lot of time talking with the scientists about the DNA studies, about the different modeling exercises. I did, again, build a mathematical model for the population trajectory that we could toggle with the threats, and that we could experiment with, like, what if the population size was this, and then how would that go forward? So I did that again. But it was very much more the behind the computer, armchair, theoretical biology than it was the being in the lab, or even I haven't been to, like, Michoacan, where they are. I would love to go to the overwintering sites and just to be there with these, incredible bugs. That would be amazing.
Well, shifting gears a little bit, could you talk about some of your more recent work with the Midwest Climate Action Science Center in Minneapolis?
So the U.S. Geological Survey has several of these climate adaptation science centers. They were sort of written into existence through Congress, and they existed in, like in Hawaii and the Southwest and the Northwest. The Midwest did not have its own sort of center, but the Northeast had a center that expanded all the way out into, like, the region that we consider Midwest, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota. So they established a new center in the Midwest, in Minnesota, and it's a combination of the federal agencies, U.S. Geological Survey and its science centers, and a consortium of universities. So the University of Minnesota hosts this USGS entity, and they have a partnership. The consortium that University of Minnesota leads includes a dozen different universities, including some of the indigenous entities like the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or College of Menominee Nation, the 1854 Treaty Authority. But then you also have Indiana University and a number of others. And I was working in the role as the research coordinator, sort of like the grant administrator. So I was working for U.S. Geological Survey with the university, with all of the different universities and all the USGS science centers to say, what do we need to study in the Midwest related to climate adaptation? Not how is climate happening, what is it going to be, but how do we adapt to it? That was a sort of a deviation from most climate research. And what it looked like was having partnerships instead of just scientists with cool ideas. It looked like working with the institutions and the individuals in certain places in the Midwest that we designated as vulnerable, to flooding, to drought, to severe storm events, and saying, in our region, we really need to figure out, what's going to happen to the maple trees that are sort of moving forward. What's going to happen to the what's going to happen with invasive species as they come up from the south, right? And so there's different questions depending on where you are in the Midwest. And I was in charge of kind of helping our portfolio to reflect science of those different questions. So USGS provides grant funding. The grant funding would go to these different investigators who are affiliated with the different universities and having partnerships with community. And so does our portfolio represent the challenges that climate is facing in the Midwest? Does our portfolio represent good partnerships? And where are we seeing opportunities to have our science translated and meet, actual applications that people are doing? What was really cool about that position was, again, just the scope of questions that you could see around climate. Everything from these specific rabbits that their fur color changes depending on the season. So they were brown, of course, in the summer and spring, and then white in the winter. But when you have winter onset changing, and then you have a disagreement between temperature fluctuations, now you have this animal that's coat is like different colors. And the reason it turns white in the winter is because there's snow everywhere, so predators won't see it. But now it's winter and there's not snow everywhere and they're white, predators, so this is another one of those evolutionary things, the selection factors were the environment. You have a project like that, and then you have projects, looking at freshwater fish and populations in the lakes of the different sport fish and the changes in, the threats from invasive species there. So full range, I'm not fully capturing it, but I, as opposed to being the scientist working on the monarchs or the Massasauga or the marine community off the coast of North Point, Oregon, I was a scientist assessing all of the things that were going on and just trying to continue to keep us all connected, because when we are aware of what each other was doing, we could be moving effectively in certain directions. I will say, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
I will say, as cool as that was scientifically, it was a little bit too far removed from the application for me. So you've heard about my work at Massasauga, Monarch, very close to like seeing a decision be made and things change. With USGS, it was very much creating the knowledge base that we will need, but not necessarily seeing it applied to the behavioral changes on the ground.
Now, do all the regional offices work together?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, they have, again, different priorities in different regions, but there's coordination as much as possible to, at the very least, keep each other informed. But there's collaboration as well. So if you're doing a project, again, on this mismatch between the morphology, the sort of physical appearance of this rabbit in the Midwest, and there's something similar going on down in the deserts in Arizona, like it could be an opportunity for those groups to speak to each other, to compare methods. So that was part of my role as well. I was looking for ways to build bridges between not only the scientists but also the communities that we all ran. So very sort of multiple layers of operation of the science. And again, I mentioned that for me it was a little bit too far removed because you might bring this up, but like I moved to a position at the Field Museum not too long after starting at USGS. So I was there for a little bit under a year before I moved to the Field Museum, where I was working on a very much more locally focused climate action plan for nature. So like the city of Chicago has their climate action plan for energy, for housing, infrastructure, but there's a consortium of individuals in the Chicago wilderness. It's individuals, it's institutions, it's those who are all kind of working around nature-based ideas and problems in this region. And there's a climate action plan for nature, for the biodiversity loss, for the threats to species, but also for the ways that people need to be connected to nature and the ways that people are part of the solution. So our behavioral changes are absolutely necessary at this point. You can't just like work over here at the forest preserves and not get involved with people in their communities and their regions around Chicago.
You spoke to some of the challenges that you faced over your career, but what gives you the motivation to overcome the challenges that you've encountered over the course of your career?
I mean, I'll be honest, I wasn't always motivated. There are times I mentioned during my PhD where I was like, I'm gonna quit. I'm just gonna take the master's and leave.
Yeah.
I can't find a reason to do this. And then I found the opportunity with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I saw the impact that I could have with my research, with my expertise. And so I finished the PhD. So that was a motivator. In general, Kristen, being a scientist, it's what we talked about earlier. It's that this is something that just brings me alive. This is something that I'm just gifted with a passion for and the skill set for. And so a lot of times I find myself saying how I refuse to let the systems that be take from me something that is like really true to me. There have been times when I've backed off of problems, projects. During my work at the Field Museum, there were some times where I just said, I won't push so hard on this particular value that I think is important for us when we're talking about nature and people, because it's costing me a lot, because I'm getting a lot of blowback, because I feel like it's disproportionate blowback. I feel like people are requiring me to demonstrate my expertise, to whip out the PhD, so to speak, and put on that certain jargony voice and use my authority as an expert. And I was like, I'm just not going to do that, because it was hurting me that I would have to do that.
Yeah.
And again, it's a matter of, this is really what drives me. And I think the world really needs all of us to show up in that way. So there's something about me that refuses to sort of give in and just step away for that reason. I have strong faith. Very much my self-worth and my value comes through my faith, and not through necessarily like the degrees or the titles or those things. So through my faith, I also have a great community. I have a great family support system. So one of the things I've usually said when I'm talking to people, especially younger people coming into the field, is like, make sure you kind of have your support system in mind, and a way that you have value outside of your scientist role, outside of just the passion, because that's going to sustain you. So that's what motivates me, is that there are people who care about me and who value me, and that means all parts of me. So that means the science part. Yeah. I can't really say that it's even just saving nature, because nature's going to be fine. It's whether we're going to be there to see it. Yeah. To be honest, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about biodiversity loss, like the Earth has seen a lot of evolutionary phases. And so it's not even just like, I've got to save nature. It's that this is part of who I am, and denying part of who you are, whatever your identity part that you're having to deny, it kills any of us on the inside, right? I think that's something we can all relate to.
Yeah, that's sound advice. Are there any stories you'd like to share from your field work and Trinidad or Bermuda or your time in Germany?
So, yes, there's so many stories. I'm trying to prioritize in my mind which stories. I'll start. You mentioned Trinidad. We haven't talked about Trinidad, but when I was an undergrad, I went to Duke, and they have a marine lab in Beaufort, North Carolina. So Duke University in Durham, marine labs in Beaufort, and they had this semester of Beaufort to Bermuda. So they had a relationship with the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Science, which was previously the Bermuda Biological Research Station. And I was like, yeah, why not? So when I was doing my Beaufort to Bermuda semester, one of the courses was a sea turtle course, and the instructor did work in Trinidad with sea turtles. So that's all the context. It's kind of another plug for like, if you're in school, look at the programs and do them. Do them. But we went to Trinidad, and he worked on leatherback sea turtles. So these are the sea turtles that were there when the KT extinction happened. Like these sea turtles were there next to dinosaurs. And when I was in Trinidad, we would go out to the beaches at night, and we would wait for them. This is when the females were coming on shore to lay their eggs. We'd wait for them to come on shore. We'd be sitting silently while they like looked around, because if you startled them, they would go back. But once they started laying the eggs, you could approach them because they kind of went into this comatose state. And so we would wait for them to come. And I remember sitting there on like a fallen log, and this female leatherback was there, and she's huge. Like I have a picture. I'm like laying on the ground next to her, and she's like, larger than me. And she's laying her eggs, and she's taking these deep breaths, like, and just slowly moving. And I'm going, whoa, what if T-Rex came stomping down the beach, right? You know what I mean? Like it just, again, that feeling in your body of just awe, this almost innate experience of the depth of time because of the presence of this majestic animal. And the skies were so clear. There was very little light pollution because we were on the eastern coast of Trinidad. The western coast is where most of like the tourism and things like that are. So that's one of my favorite memories. And it's like, it's not a funny story, but it strikes so much awe in me when I think about it. What the funny part of it was the people who were hosting us were people who lived there. They talked about how they would go out and literally fist fight poachers at night, because as these large animals come up, people would come out and just like hack off a fin and go and like sell the meat. And so they would just like go out there and just wait, and they would like get into fist fights. And I'm like, really? Can you imagine like, two people fist fighting on the beach while this majestic animal is just laying its eggs? Just that sort of struck me as odd. I would say there was a time in I also did some work out of Puget Sound. So Friday Harbor Labs, which is with the University of Washington, had a summer program that I did up there, and we looked at these invasive clams. They were coming from Japan, and the clams that were invasive were becoming hosts to these native crabs. They're pea crabs that live inside of clams. So there was a horse clam, which is a pretty large clam that like lives really deep in the sand, that these pea crabs live inside of, and they just sit on its little gills and they just eat the food that the clam is pulling in. So they're like parasites. And these invasive clams were shallower than the depth of the horse clam. So these pea crabs were like moving up the sort of the beach in terms of their range, because of these. So we'd be digging out these clams, and we'd open the clams, and these little crabs would come scurrying out, these little tiny crabs. And I remember being like, I'm going to set up a cage match. So one of my experiments was to put two crabs into a clam and see who won, see who got kicked out, see who stayed. And I'm like, this is some strange science that I'm doing this. And but nonetheless, it was a really kind of key question of like this interaction. Invasive species are usually kind of considered like a bad thing or like a destructive thing. Well, like, is it a bad thing that this population of pea crabs is growing? Like, is it a helpful? I was an undergrad it was like a 10-week project, so I didn't really get to answer all the really big questions. But I just remember these little pea crabs like running around our lab. That summer, I must have cleaned, and I see the word, we were shucking clams, right? It was over 5,000 of these things, because we would collect them in the field and bring them to the lab. We'd clean them up, we'd find the pea crabs, we'd measure them, we'd weigh them, all this stuff. Yes, I didn't eat clams or mussels or anything for a long time.
So would the crabs fight then?
Yes.
If they were,
Yes, one would get kicked out. You'd find one. So I had them in these little trays in the lab with, enough water. And so I'd mark them and put them inside the clams. And then I'd come back and one of the crabs would be kind of out watering the tray and one other would be just nestled in there, just happy. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes both stayed in there. Or they maybe found a way to coexist. But
was the crab with the larger claw the winner in these confrontations?
It was no consistent pattern. I put male and female. I put larger and smaller.
With no patterns?
No.
Interesting.
I wondered, what kind of personalities they had.
What do you think is the biggest misconception people have about people in your field of study?
Biggest misconception? Well, I have...
Or it could just be biologists in general, I guess.
Yeah, I think that in general, people may think we know what we're doing. And I say it like that on purpose because we do have... Science is a systematic approach to answering questions, right? And we do have a lot of really great accountability in the field to have good questions and have solid data come out of it. But the way that it starts and the way that it comes together is very much sort of an exploratory activity. And so I think when people meet scientists or meet experts, they're just like, wow, you know so much. But if you have been in science long enough, you're like, wow, we still don't know so much. You realize how much we don't know. And you go out with a question, but you go out prepared for if that question has to shift, if the field work doesn't go the way you want it to go, if the data comes back and you're just kind of like, I didn't see that. I mean, that's most of a PhD is the time it takes to figure out data that nobody's ever seen before. Right? Once you have a PhD, you've been through the process of like, okay, I don't understand this. Let's attack it these different ways. But when you're going through a PhD and it's your first time doing it, most people I talk to would say like, I could go back and do it in like half the time because you know the way there. But I think a lot of the science that is, on TV or when you go to the aquarium, you talk to an expert or whatever, is coming from the curiosity and the kind of incidental happenings of the work we're doing. And people think like, oh, you just must be a smart person, you just have like a really great brain, you just like know innately some things about the world. So I don't want to downplay the strong expertise and training of scientists, but I want to point to the fact that it's not nearly, well, to me, it shouldn't be nearly as intimidating to talk to experts as some people may feel it. And I think it's a misconception that we aren't just, humans too, who have our own insecurities and questions and needs. That may not be something that other scientists you talk to would agree with. So I should speak for myself.
No, I think that's a good point. And also that we know so little, really, There's so much more that we need to learn about everything
and
in
it's
the
constantly
biological
changing.
world.
That's the beauty of the world we live in too. It's still changing.
Yeah. Can you discuss some of the best and worst advice you've received over the course of your career?
Okay.
If you want to skip this one, we can.
No, I think it's a good question because I think we all get sort of a different groups of advice, I would say. So there's advice on how to live your life, there's advice on how to do your research, and I've gotten a lot of bad advice on how to, I would say compartmentalize my life within my research. And I say that bad advice in terms of, when I was in grad school and I was dating my now husband, I was given advice to just, if you get engaged, like don't wear your ring because your committee, your professors will think that you are going to now be unstable because if you break up with that person or if you could be unstable, or if you get married now, you're going to be worried about having a family and kids. You're not going to be serious about your science. Just, I think, I value wearing my ring and being with my partner. Not everybody has the same things, but that's not something that I think should affect my science. And it made me think constantly about whether I was wearing or not, because that's, something I was like, what are they thinking about this or that? That's energy that could have been spent on my actual research.
Yeah.
That's energy that was not healthy to be, just spending on something that I didn't really have much to change about. I couldn't change that. So I think there's a lot of bad advice around dress a certain way or look a certain way. Like scientist has to be, serious. There's advice around putting off having a family or putting off, and none of us are promised each day. So I think living your life and then pursuing your passion should be something that there's enough space for. So that's some of the bad advice. Some of the good advice that I've gotten includes kind of this is very specific, but one of my supervisor at the Fish and Wildlife Service told me that you will always find people who talk too much in your place of work. So it's important to practice techniques to get out of those interactions. So, somebody comes up to you, you went to the bathroom, they stop you, they start talking to you. What are your go-to techniques to say, it's been great talking, I gotta get back to my desk, or to close the conversation? And I thought that was kind of very specific and odd at the time, but it became so important as I went through kind of my career, because no matter what role I was in, there's always people who stop you and just talk. And I can even be that person sometimes. I can be having a slow day and I'm like, hey, Paul, how's it going? What are you working on? And to be able to find a way to sort of say, I would love to talk. Would you like to get lunch tomorrow? Right now I'm working on something. Or, I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm going to sit down and do this. I'll talk to you later. Having those ready, because in the moment you can kind of be like, it can be mean or, whatever. That was a really good piece of advice. I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure there are others, but I'll stop there.
How has your work studying biology impacted your humanity?
How has it impacted my humanity? I will say from the beginning, since I was a kid, I noticed sort of degradation in the environment. So I grew up in Maryland. We would go crabbing. We crabbed through setting traps off the dock, and also through using our own individual string with chicken neck tied to it and catching a crab. And as I got older, we were no longer allowed to do that. There were permits required. There were fewer crabs. I saw just the change in my short little lifetime from age 6 to age 10. And so I've seen, just how quickly we as humans impact the environment. And that has given me, I would say, a little bit of a heaviness. So I can go more recently when I was walking along the lakefront and I'm just I'm seeing all the different trash, and I'm seeing the hardscape where, the beaches have been so worn away that we've had to put out hard surfaces to keep the water from eating away. There's a heaviness around me, kind of a feeling of the disconnect between us as people and nature, the relationship between us and nature, and more the transactions between us and nature. At the same time, there's an awe, because as I learned about the marine baselines in my graduate program, or as I get a chance to travel to Trinidad or the Bahamas during graduate school, there are places in the world where you're just like, wow, there's such diversity, beauty, life, that even the hard things of the world, the disconnect I see, is not necessarily important in that moment. There's an awe. And I think that's sort of in how I experience my own body too. It's I get injured and I heal. Now it's really inconvenient to get injured. It's really inconvenient to have to go to the doctors. But I look and I'm like, wow, the same way I see nature going along, my body can heal with the right support. That's incredible. So I have this, as a human, I have this tension between heaviness and the sort of despondency that comes along with having current administration that doesn't support climate change. But I also have this certainty that nature is going to persist, and that I get to see that unfold in small ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think holding those two things has changed the kind of nature of who I am. I'm not so black and white. I'm not so hyper fixated on certain things. I'm a little bit more open to other stories and possibilities. We talked about different knowledges earlier. I think as a scientist, my appreciation for knowledges outside of just the academic sense grew because of what I saw in what I was learning.
Yeah, that dichotomy is interesting, right?
Right.
What's one piece of advice you'd like to share with the listeners?
There's something I think we talked about when we first, got in contact about this podcast, which is that we all have stories. We all have a relationship with nature. Mm-hmm. So I think right now my advice would be to kind of prioritize getting into nature. Prioritize going inward in a way to say, what makes me excited about nature? Is it being by the lake? Is it going to Garfield Park Conservatory? Is it going to Peggy Notabart Nature Museum, to the butterfly room where they just kind of surround you? And I say that because I don't think that we all would immediately think of those places, but they are here, even like living in the city of Chicago. So wherever you are, if you're in some place where it's easier to access nature, someplace a little bit further outside of like a city or urbanized area, and you can go and do it, like find a way to say like, what is my dose of nature on a regular basis? You're taking your vitamins, you may have other medications. How are you dosing yourself with nature? And I think that really will be what helps us to relate better to each other and to these issues in the world. And I mentioned several times that people having their own particular passions and their authentic selves in this world helps us solve problems. And so I genuinely think that all of us have a connection to nature in that way. And going back out, kind of prioritizing, how do I dose myself with nature? Well, I hope bring us a little bit closer in some of these conversations about our natural resources and things, and that will benefit all of us. Again, nature's going to be here, but being in relationship with nature is really going to make our lives, more rich and more fulfilling.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. Can you share your top 3 book recommendations for people? It doesn't have to be nonfiction. Like, are there books that have been influential or important in your own life? Like you'd mentioned Silent Spring with Rachel Carson, is that?
Yeah. Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, that was a good one. I was thinking in a little bit different direction. There's a book called What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry. And it's not a nature-oriented book, but it's kind of about the nature of, like, it's a psychology book. It's kind of about the nature of how we become who we are. And I was really influenced by that book during the pandemic because it made me think about how we all experience traumas in different ways. And that kind of brings me to the point of advice I shared about like being in nature and having dosing with nature. So it kind of made me think of, it definitely made me think of how I am as a human in the environment that I live in, like externally. So that one, there's a book called Been Outside. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's like about non-binary and non-traditional experiences in nature. So it's kind of a collection of different scientists of backgrounds that are not sort of what you would anticipate. And it's a really cool way to say like, oh yeah, they got into nature this way or that way. Some cool field stories in there. It's tough because off the top of my head, there's 2.
That's good. That's plenty good.
I think, I don't know about a question, but one of the ideas that occurred to me when I was thinking about this conversation was the importance of longer term thinking when we are thinking about our roles and our jobs and whatever. So when I was in grad school, I had a cohort that I was with, and as we moved through grad school, I mean undergrad, really, in any sort of program, you have a cohort of people. And as you get older, that cohort disperses throughout different jobs and different roles. And one of the things that I've kind of learned or been thinking about is that, relationships with each other are really important. And one day we're going to be the ones, like my generation or my cohort, are going to be the ones making some of these decisions that are like big decisions, like at the level of federal government or at the level of university. So what I want to say is to pay attention to your peers, pay attention to the people who are working around you, having good relationships with them and being curious, even about work that's not close to yours, because that is the future network. And I think networking is a word that's loaded, so I'm careful about saying that, because we kind of go into it as what I can exchange, I need to know you so that I can connect with you about a job. But I think it's really about that we all have different roles in a kind of collective society, and I might want to network with you because I know somebody who you would really want to work with. I really know somebody who you might want to interview, next on this podcast. Or I might want to be connected with people because I eventually meet some young person who I want to send to follow up on the research that somebody else did in the area. So again, that being aware of our peers and kind of celebrating them, how do we come with more of a community mindset to doing the work instead of just the individualistic mindset of finding your own thing and becoming the best at it. Mm-hmm. That feels to me like an important issue. I hope I'm explaining it clearly enough, but there is no scarcity in the knowledge, and especially in biology, there's no scarcity in the work to be done. So how do we collectively try to take down some of these barriers that kind of hoard resources and hoard our even technical skills because we want to be the expert or because we want to be able to prove something to someone, to ourselves even.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
Great.
Well, thank you, Kristen, for your time. I sincerely appreciate it.
I enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.